Hello, and welcome to this short presentation on the Elizabethan theater, the theater of the world of William Shakespeare. As I said in my previous video on Shakespeare himself, any of these videos that introduce folks to such a huge thing as Elizabethan theater, I'm fully aware of the limitations of this and the sort of pitfalls of this. I think for my newer readers of Shakespeare that are my students, or if you're just watching this out of curiosity, I don't know. I just think the more we know, the better. I'm not one of those people that thinks one has to know Shakespeare's, eating and drinking habits and social security number in order to read him, nor does one have to know that a common snack among Elizabethan theater goers were hazelnuts. I don't think that's vital information. I do think, though, that, as I said in my previous video, that folks enter into the imaginative space differently. Some people like knowing the politics of an era, the religion of the era, the fashion of an era. So I'm just going to mention a few of those things in the hopes that it can make entering into maybe reading or watching some Shakespeare a little more rich and interesting for you. So first of all, something that's very different about going to a play in Shakespeare's time versus now is now we're very much, at least in the States, very much discouraged from participating. We're, as it says in Hamlet, mute audience to this act, right? We're meant to sit and watch and maybe applaud at times and laugh and react, but not to interact. Look at how close, this is obviously a current stage production in the New Globe Theater of Henry V. And the actors, sometimes in the voice of a prologue or a narrator, were aware that many of these plays could not be realistically created on a small stage. So Henry V actually was thought to have been produced at the Curtain Theater. The Globe wasn't a thing yet, and the Curtain was a circle, a circular theater. This is how Henry V begins. Henry V obviously tells of the tale of, shockingly, Henry V, and it climaxes with the Battle of Agincourt, where the English and French forces have this huge battle. Now, the movie versions can show this. The Brana version from 1989 is awesome. Imagine not having any horses, having a handful. There was about 14 actors in Shakespeare's acting troupe, trying to stage this humongous battle. So the prologue comes out and basically tells the audience their job in making this play work. And here's what it sounds like. First of all, it begins like an epic poem. This is such a huge thing, the narrator says, that I need to pray to the muses, the gods of inspiration that, Homer and Virgil pray to. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, this is Henry V, like himself, assume the port of Mars. This man Harry that we knew as a young boy in the Henry IV plays is now King Henry, who has the sort of body and image of Mars, the god of war. And at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon, and gentles all the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold, the stage, right? The stage is not worthy to show these events. It's a humble beginning to a play, to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or maybe cram within this wooden O, this is the Curtain Theater, the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies, England and France, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. It's reminiscent of the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, where the narrator says, our toil shall strive to mend all of the things that you don't understand about this prologue. Here, the narrator says, look, we're going to show you these events imperfectly. There's no way we can do this on the stage. It isn't the movies where you could stage a battle with actual horses and swords and have corpses littering a large field. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts, into 1,000 parts divide on man, and make imaginary puissance, power. And I love the next two lines. It is the nature of being at a play. And here, Shakespeare goes kind of meta and actually tells the audience how to be at the play. Think when we talk of horses that you see them, printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings. Carry them here and there, jumping over times. This is what the audience thought's job is. Decking kings, carrying them all over the place, jumping over times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply admit me, chorus to this history, who, prologue-like, your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. So it's interesting, and Shakespeare does this in several plays, most notably Romeo and Juliet and Henry V, gives the audience a particular job. Okay, where were the theaters? The Rose, the Globe, the Curtain, the Swan, were all in the wrong side of town. They were in Southwark, the south side of the river, where you had numerous whorehouses, strangely enough, mostly owned by the same men that own the theaters, right? And it's sort of like now, if you own a theater, you'd want like nice, usually when you go to a theater district, like in Boston, there's nice restaurants in the area. This isn't a nice area, so the businesses are very different. You also have dicing here and gambling. These were the folks. These were the folks that that peopled the area in Southwark. What was the acting like? This is very rarely discussed, and I want to say this image is from a movie that I really would recommend highly. It's called Stage Beauty. Billy Crudup, Claire Danes, Rupert Everett, Stage Beauty. And acting was, the goal of theater wasn't realism. Now, when you go to the movies or you go to see a play, if something doesn't seem believable and realistic, we often say, I'm not into this, right? Even if 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 you're in a Harry Potter or Star Wars, the Lord of the Rings universe, it sort of creates its own rules for what's realistic and then has to stick to them. They have to look like people look and act and react like people act and react. Not the point of Shakespearean theater, right? So, for example, the acting was super formulaic. So if you were expressing, say, shock or sadness, you might do this with your hand, and that would signal to the audience that that's what was going on, which seems so ridiculous now. I was reading earlier today in a biography of Shakespeare that there were actually 59 prescribed gestures just for the hands. So this is one of them, right, that you see in the picture here. Realism's not the goal. It's sort of big thoughts, big clear feelings. And I don't know, I just think that's interesting. So what was acting like? Very physical, not realistic. So what kind of people wrote plays? Well, on the left, you have a list of folks who went to university, and that was sort of commonly the common resume for playwriters. You have Ben Jonson, I think his first father was a minister but died before he was born. His second father was a bricklayer. So Jonson was classically educated but also working class, similar to Shakespeare. So you have the university guys and you have the blue collar working class guys. Something that's interesting too to pay attention to is that this was the first generation of professional writers, people that wrote professionally for the stage, the very first generation. And so the university educated people and working class people, educated, but working class educated people wrote plays. But there were no rules. Ben Jonson's plays are very different than Shakespeare's plays, as are the plays of the men on the left. Some are like wildly over the top and violent. Some are more subtle. Some follow a certain classical set of patterns, like Ben Jonson's plays. Shakespeare is constantly reinventing what plays are. So it's sort of like when movies came out in the early 20th century, when novels became popular in the 18th into 19th century, there were no rules. People were inventing the rules. So that's kind of an interesting element of theater in the Elizabethan age, that the first generation of professional writers are inventing what theater is. So, how were Elizabethan plays like music on YouTube? I know that there are musicians, I think Prince was one of them, he died somewhat recently, that he refused to have any of his stuff on YouTube. And there are other musicians who just love being as ubiquitously present online as possible. So they have, 8 million concerts you can get on YouTube for free. There's different schools of thought about that. But what we know is if any of you are performers, that sometimes you go and you find a favorite singer and you get one of her songs, and then you click on it on YouTube and you realize, oh, this is just a crappy, cell phone recording of it. And it's, maybe it wasn't a good night for performance for the performer. And then sometimes you get really professional recordings. It's similar in Shakespeare's day. Plays would evolve. It was very much like more like a workshop environment. They very rarely considered a play finished. Plays were written in 4 to 6 weeks and performed kind of off and on throughout the history of the company. Sometimes a member of royalty would ask in 1607 to put on, Romeo and Juliet, which maybe came out 11 years, 12 years before that, and they would just have to rehearse it quickly and do it. So it's not like now where you have, a copy of a play and that's the play. But you do see in the first sort of early edition of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, we have to be or not to be, there's the point. And then it evolves into what we have now. And the most sort of finalized version of Shakespeare's plays is called the First Folio. You probably want to know this, the First Folio, that his acting buddies put together a few years after he died. And those are at the time anyway, the most definitive versions of the Shakespeare plays, because until then, there were just myriad different versions floating around. So interestingly, and I think a lot of people know this, only men and boys are allowed on stage because the Puritans have a pretty strong influence in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. Women are not allowed on stage. It was considered, morally inappropriate. So women weren't allowed on stage, if I remember correctly, until the Restoration in 1660. Shakespeare dies in 1616, so he never saw women on stage. So boys whose voices didn't change and super expert actor men, this is what that movie Stage Beauty reflects on. Stage Beauty reflects on the last generation of male actors playing women, and when women started being allowed to act as women, the sort of identity crisis that those men suffered through. It's really, really interesting. There are letters of the time period of folks who travel to other European countries where women are allowed on stage. And they return and say, oh, it's really interesting. The women in France are almost as good as the boys, acting as women back home. So this is just a peculiar thing. There would have been no intimacy on stage, long kisses, or anything physically sexual. That wasn't a thing. It was very sort of physically formulaic. It would have rubbed us the wrong way as an audience now. Here's an interesting thing. I mentioned Saturday Night Live earlier. You certainly couldn't openly satirize or mock powerful figures. There was a man whose job it was to censor popular entertainment. He was called the Master of the Revels. And Edmund Tilney, Tilney, was the sort of famous Master of Revels under Queen Elizabeth. He makes an appearance in the famous movie Shakespearean Love, which was an Academy Award-winning film that came out in 1998. Edmund Tilney. And initially it was, if you were going to perform at court, the Master of Revels would have to review the performance first. But really, to make a performance super public, the Master of Revels would have to see there wasn't anything scandalous in it. As you might know, Queen Elizabeth, at the end of her reign, she died in 1603, but 1600, 1601, 59.9, that era, there was a lot of plots against her life. The Spanish Armada, Catholic Spanish Armada was getting stronger. There was more Catholic Irish rebellions, and Catholicism was kind of lurking in England as well, as dangerous as it was to be Catholic. So anyway, there was a play, Richard II, here's Richard II here, that Shakespeare's play that some argued contributed to the Essex Rebellion in 1601 that was hoping to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. Richard II is an amazing play, and it's largely about deposing, getting rid of a monarch, Richard II. And Elizabeth, who knew all the plots that were around her, she had spies everywhere, including some playwrights, we think. Elizabeth was thought to have said, "I am Richard II. Know you not that?" In other words, people are trying to overthrow me. So the conspirators against Elizabeth asked the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare's acting buddies, to perform Richard II on the day of the plot to kill the queen. And they were hoping it would rally the people to overthrow the monarch, because the play ends with overthrowing a monarch. And that was the goal. So on February 8th, the Earl of Essex, who used to be a favorite of the Queen, marched into London with 300 armed men. And people didn't rally behind him. So he was captured. And a couple weeks later, on February 25th, 1601, he was beheaded for treason. So what we don't know is, did Shakespeare and his acting buddies know what they were doing? Did they know they were actually being included in a political plot to overthrow the Queen? They were paid 40 shillings to perform that play, more than the usual rate. So I have to think they were somewhat suspicious of that. And interestingly, they weren't in any trouble. A lot of scholars believe that because Elizabeth loved Shakespeare and the theater and loved this acting company, that there were no charges against Shakespeare's acting company for performing this play. So I don't know. I just think that stuff's really interesting. So who attended the plays? Again, for new readers, particularly new young readers, I think we think of Shakespeare as like a marble statue, and only really smart people understand him and read him. But here's an interesting fact. Approximately, this is from Shakespeare in Love, but about 3,000 people could occupy the Globe theater space, really, like way more crowded than any theater space any of us will ever be in. We think about 5% of people in London could read at the time. We think about a third of the men in London could read or sign their name. So what that probably means is about 3/4 of Shakespeare's audience. So when you're reading a difficult play like The Tempest or Macbeth or Hamlet, and you're wondering what things mean, and you're confused about some language, be aware that 3/4 of the original audience of that play couldn't read or sign their name. And I think that's just so important. It's so important. Royalty attended the plays. Working class people paid a penny to stand throughout the plays. People paid a little more money to sit there. But all kinds of people, from the monarchs to illiterates, attended the plays. I think that says something about Shakespeare. But I also think it is a reminder to us that particularly the first time we're experiencing, I say this to teachers too, the first time experiencing a Shakespeare play, we should not be worried about understanding all of it or any of it, frankly. We should be experiencing it like these folks here as much as possible, in a visceral, heart-level way. There will be time to analyze. There will be time for thesis papers. There will be time for all of that. But I think the first couple of times experiencing a play, we should experience it with our guts and our heart. Because I think that's how it was experienced initially, and I like to honor that. So because people didn't have private agents, if you talk to movie stars now, they have agents that take care of their contracts and protect them. Here we have the Lord Chamberlain. Here we have King James. Lord Chamberlain was the initial sponsor of Shakespeare's acting company, hence Lord Chamberlain's men. Unfortunately, Lord Chamberlain was involved with the Essex plot of 1601, so he was arrested for treason. But when King James took over in 1603, he was a lover of theater, and Shakespeare's acting company. Um, Shakespeare's acting company became the king's men. So I don't know what analogy there would be now. It's sort of like having a regular gig at the White House, you know. And because they were the king's men, they were obligated to wear the clothes of the king's men, what was called the livery, the particular cap, the particular doublet or little jacket, the hose, and cloak. They were obligated to wear that, but that was really major swagger, walking around wearing the king's livery at formal events. This is a far cry from the poor players, the poor actors that they were when they moved the theater to the South Bank of London. This is a very, very different situation. They were performing later in Shakespeare's life more indoors, more for sort of a better class of people, as it were. So the main theaters of the age, the Curtain, the Rose, the Swan, the Globe, initially, James Burbage, in the middle of the 16th century, started the first public theater, and in a obvious fit of inspiration called it the theater. Here we have the remake of the Globe Theater. And these public theaters, it was just a really hot take, a really hot ticket. New play happened, everybody was talking about it. So this is the new Globe Theater, obviously outdoors. And I think it's really, really important to know. There's a really great book called Shakespeare's Globe. It's an old book, probably 60, 70 years old. That's really, really good. And the thesis of it is that a really good reading of Shakespeare's plays includes the fact that he wrote the plays for a particular space. And that includes the later plays, which were also written for the Blackfriars Theater space, which was indoors with candles. So here's some specifics about the Globe Theater. I think this is interesting. Sometimes you'd get a playbill on the street, come see Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet or whatever, but you'd also wandering around see a particular flag above the theater. Black for tragedy, white for comedy, red for history. It's like now you would go online and see, what movies are playing. And maybe if you want an action adventure movie, you would go see that, or Mission Impossible, something like that, if you want a romantic comedy. So they would do that with the color of a flag here. And then there's a variety of levels, right? You have the groundlings. People would stand, pay a penny. And you have the various galleries where people would spend more. It would be, I think, an extra penny for a cushion to sit on. If you had a lot of money and want to show off how important you were, you could actually get a seat on stage and the actors would work around you. I don't know. I don't think that's good for self-conscious people. You have a holdover from the medieval morality plays, the heavens up here, and under the stage, the trapdoor, and underneath, which they would call hell. And this would be called the mouth of hell. So whenever you have like ghosts speaking from the great beyond, like mark me, Hamlet's father's ghost maybe would be speaking from down below. And no, it's just this dressing rooms back here, but this is the theater space. It's outside. If it rains, you get rained on. That's what it is. Unless you got under the roof, which is why those seats are more expensive. But anyway, Shakespeare wrote very much for this space. And I don't know, I hope it's a pretty fascinating period of time. As I said, London is young. London is volatile. And in London, any direction can happen with any thought. And art is being invented and reinvented in real time throughout Shakespeare's life. So I just think when we crack open a Shakespeare play, all of that's just really interesting to keep in mind. I hope this helps you, and good luck with your reading and viewing.